Pope Leo XIV reveals Black Israelites' lost prayer priests tried erasing. Centuries of silence collapsed in a single breath-stealing instant. Pope Leo XIV stepped from the shadows of guarded tradition to reveal a prayer so ancient, so potent, that whispers claim the Church itself once sought to erase it from existence. Bound to the lineage of the Black Biblical Israelites and entombed for generations in the Vatican's most forbidden archives, this lost prayer does more than echo across history. It challenges the very architecture of what we have been taught about faith, identity, and the nature of divine power. It is not merely an artifact, but a living ember, a truth buried beneath centuries of dust and denial, now flaring into the light. What follows is not simply a story, it is a revelation with the power to shake the pillars of modern Christianity, to demand that we look again at the ground beneath our beliefs, and to ask whether we have built upon bedrock or upon sand. If this story stirs your curiosity and your spirit, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the deeper truths we uncover, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your voice in this unfolding conversation. Pope Leo XIV drops a bombshell, the prayer the Church tried to bury forever. It is a rare and disquieting occurrence when a pope speaks in such a way that the very ground beneath one's certainties seems to shift. When the familiar architecture of faith cathedrals of doctrine, buttressed by centuries of careful interpretation, trembles under the weight of a single human voice. History has taught us to expect pontiffs to measure their words with the precision of a jeweler, each syllable set with deliberate care, mindful that the slightest misstep might ripple across continents and echo through the centuries. Yet on that fateful evening in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo XIV's voice carried none of the guarded diplomacy for which the Vatican is renowned. There was no calculated hesitation to soften the blow of dangerous truths. His tone was stripped bare of ornament and devoid of apology. It was the voice of a man who had gazed too long into the eyes of a hidden reality and concluded that silence would be the greater sin. His words did not arrive like measured theological refinements or cautious policy statements. They fell like a stone through glass, an unfiltered detonation of truth whose shockwave rolled down every gilded corridor of the Church. For decades, perhaps centuries, whispers had moved like shadows through the scholarly world. Rumors of a prayer older than Rome, older even than the Temple in Jerusalem, a fragment of the divine spoken in the dawn of human memory. It was said to be the sacred inheritance of the Black Biblical Israelites, a people whose place in sacred history had been quietly excised, erased, or recast in the hues of imperial convenience. This prayer, the whispers insisted, was not a perfunctory litany, nor the rote repetition of familiar petitions. It was the living spark of the soul's original fire, a cry torn from humanity's deepest remembrance of its maker, a flame that, if ever uncovered, could awaken the sleeping embers of a people's divine identity. In the vast marble hush of that basilica, the Pope began not with proclamation, but with confession, a gesture more dangerous than any decree. He told of his descent into a restricted archive deep beneath the Vatican Library, a labyrinth of stone and shadow whose catalog numbers appear in no public record, whose corridors vanish from every official map as though they never existed. These were not the storied chambers known to tourists or even to most scholars. They were a sanctum of guarded silence, a place where even time seemed reluctant to pass. It was there, under the flicker of ancient lamps, that he claimed to have found it, an iron-bound chest, its metal darkened by centuries of breathless neglect, its lock etched with symbols absent from any ecclesiastical inventory. When the lid at last yielded, it revealed a scroll wrapped in crimson cloth. The fibers were worn but unbroken, the threads embroidered with a lion, an olive tree, and a rising sun. As he unrolled it, the parchment crackled like dry leaves, yet the ink seemed untouched by time, as though some unseen hand had preserved it for this very hour. Upon its surface lay the prayer, words inscribed in an ancient Semitic script, flanked by annotations in early Coptic, Ge'ez, in Latin, a polyglot testimony to a truth carried across centuries and tongues. This, Pope Leo declared, was the lost prayer, hidden by priests of a bygone age who feared the upheaval it would bring. The scandal was instantaneous. For this was not the presentation of an obscure historical curiosity. It was, in effect, an accusation that the church itself had conspired to bury a sacred inheritance, that it had participated not in the theft of gold or relics, but in the theft of a people's spiritual birthright. Outrage crackled through the hierarchy, disbelief wrestled with indignation in the halls of power. Yet Pope Leo XIV stood unmoved before the swelling storm. "If the truth destroys us," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of both judgment and absolution, "then we were built on lies." That single sentence did more than shock. It tore open a vault sealed for centuries, forcing into the light questions that could not easily be returned to darkness. It was not the kind of statement one could unhear. It did not merely challenge dogma. It invited every believer to examine the foundation upon which their faith had been built. In that moment, the Pope ceased to be merely the Bishop of Rome. He became the reluctant herald of a truth too dangerous to remain in chains, a truth whose implications stretch far beyond gilded altars and carved pulpits, reaching into the very marrow of what it means to believe. Inside the Forbidden Archives, how Pope Leo XIV unearthed the Israelites' sacred words. Beneath the marble majesty and gilded ceilings of the Vatican lies a different world entirely, a world where stone corridors echo not with hymns, but with the heavy footfalls of secrecy. A place Pope Leo XIV would later call the labyrinth of memory. It is a city beneath the city, carved out of shadow and stillness, where the air is thick with the ghostly scent of parchment gum and the faint perfume of candle smoke, the kind of air that feels as though it has been breathing in silence for centuries. To wander there is to step outside the familiar tyranny of clocks. For in the Forbidden Archives, time is not linear. It hangs suspended, as though the present is in quiet negotiation with the past. The faithful whisper legends about these chambers, that some lamps burn with oil blessed before the fall of Constantinople, their flames carrying the prayers of empires long turned to dust, that there are drawers and cabinets locked since the Inquisition's darkest nights, their contents deemed too dangerous or too heretical for mortal hands. Leo's journey into these catacombs began not as a mission, but as the quiet pursuit of a question, one that lodged itself in his mind like a splinter while he was studying the prophetic cadences of Isaiah. In a brittle, yellowed 17th century commentary, his eye caught an anomalous footnote, no more than a few cryptic lines, speaking of a prayer carried in the mouths of those who fled Egypt twice, once from Pharaoh and once from the priests of Rome. Many would have dismissed it as poetic exaggeration, the kind of flourish a scribe might indulge to elevate the mystique of his text. But Leo was a man attuned to the subterranean currents of history, to the way certain truths seem to hum beneath the surface of official narratives. He could not turn away from the image those words painted of a people carrying something sacred across not merely deserts and seas, but across centuries of erasure. Guided by an aging archivist, whose name he has never revealed, perhaps to shield the man from the storm that would follow, Leo descended into the depths. One by one, iron gates swung open at his passing, each accompanied by the deep ringing sound of a key turning in an ancient lock. Down winding stone staircases he went, the walls sweating with centuries of damp, past ossuaries where the bones of saints lay stacked in silent vigil, and store rooms where relics slumbered in jars sealed with wax, as though even the air might profane them. Finally, he arrived at a vault unlike the others, its entrance sealed by the rare triple key protocol. One key in the Pope's possession, one in the hands of the Secretary of State, and the third guarded by an order of cloistered nuns whose vows of silence had outlasted monarchies. When the final lock was undone, the vault revealed a single object, a chest of black iron, its surface mottled with the patina of forgotten centuries. Symbols were etched into the lid's strange interlacing marks that no catalog had recorded, their meaning perhaps known only to those who had once placed the chest there. With a groan like a reluctant confession, the lid yielded, and inside lay a scroll wrapped in crimson cloth, its fabric softened by the touch of time, yet still intact. Embroidered into that cloth were three figures, a lion, an olive tree, and a rising sun, each seeming to whisper its own parable to those with eyes to see. The Pope's hands trembled as he unwrapped it, the parchment within crackling faintly like the brittle leaves of an ancient tree stirred by the first breath of autumn. The ink was impossibly vivid, as though the words had been written only yesterday. Yet it was clear this was a survivor from an age when the boundaries between myth and memory were still porous. The prayer itself was brief, no more than 20 lines, but each word seemed to carry the weight of continents. Translation, Leo would later confess, felt almost like an act of sacrilege, for the original script shimmered with an untranslatable gravity. Its opening did not address a God enthroned in unreachable majesty, far above the reach of dust and sweat, but the God who walked in the cool of the first dawn, who knelt in the soil to breathe life into the first man and woman, whose breath was the wind in their lungs. The prayer did not speak of liberation as some distant promise to be fulfilled at the end of days. It named freedom as a present, burning reality, as immediate as the beating of one's own heart. And within its rhythm was woven a name, an ancient name of God so sacred it had not been uttered publicly since the prophets walked the earth. The marginalia were no less compelling. In faded but legible hands, they spoke of the Black Biblical Israelites, a people who had carried this prayer across centuries like a living ember cupped in their hands. It had been their compass through exile and chains, their reminder of a covenant no empire could annul. The notes recorded how this prayer had been spoken in secret gatherings, in whispered defiance of rulers who claimed the right to stand between God and his children. And the same notes now inked in Latin by a far colder hand revealed how the early church, perceiving in it a dangerous power to unite the scattered children of Israel and to awaken memories of a God who could not be contained by temples or thrones, had moved swiftly to confiscate it. To preserve their own authority, priests had ordered its suppression. Those who refused to surrender their copies were silenced, sometimes by exile, sometimes by imprisonment, sometimes by methods that left no trace in the official histories, but which history nonetheless remembers in the shudder of its silences. It was in this vault, amid the dust of centuries and the quiet company of bones, that Leo felt the twin weights of revelation and responsibility settle upon him. For in holding that scroll, he was not simply touching parchment and ink. He was touching the pulse of a story buried alive, the heartbeat of a truth forced into hiding, not because it was false, but because it was too ungovernable to be left in the hands of the people. The explosive meaning why this lost prayer terrifies religious power structures. Why should a mere 20 lines of ancient poetry strike terror into the marble halls of religious authority? Why should the ink of forgotten centuries feel to the ruling order like acid seeping into the foundations of its power? The answer, as Pope Leo XIV would first whisper and then thunder, lay not in the ornament of the language, but in the liberation it promised. A liberation too uncompromising to be domesticated, too intimate to be mediated by institution. The prayer bore no flattering petitions for the empire's blessing, no sacralized loyalty oaths to the crowns of kings, no incense offered to the continuity of a bishop's seat. Instead, it breathed fire against the architecture of oppression, calling for the dismantling of every throne that exalted itself above justice, for the shattering of all dominions that dared to masquerade as divine while grinding the poor underfoot. It proclaimed with unambiguous cadence that God's covenant was not a prisoner of any one temple, city, or priesthood, that the holy flame burned equally and without partiality in the secret chambers of every soul who walked in the light of the Creator. For a power structure whose lifeblood was the claim to stand between God and humanity, such words were not merely inconvenient. They were dynamite laid at the base of the edifice. For centuries, ecclesiastical authority had fortified its walls with the mortar of mediation, insisting that without its sacraments, its rituals, or to sanction interpreters, the divine remained locked away. Yet if every believer could enter the holy presence without the intercession of ordained gatekeepers, the gilded corridors of ecclesiastical power would be stripped of their necessity, revealed as beautiful but hollow shells. If God's favor flowed not from baptism into the Roman fold, but from the practice of justice and mercy that transcended the artificial borders of empire, then what would remain of the Church's hold over the souls of the world? Leo spoke of these implications without veil or hesitation, fully aware that such candor was the tinder of ecclesiastical fury. A prayer that returns God to the people, he declared, is a prayer that threatens every kingdom built in his name. In those words, the Pope named the most dangerous kind of truth, the kind that strips away the myth of divine endorsement from the machinery of power. This, he insisted, was the true reason the scroll had been hidden. Not because it was heresy, but because it was too true. Because it refused to be domesticated into a blessing for empire. It called the oppressed to remember their divine inheritance, and it forced the oppressor to look into the mirror of their own mortal fragility. For those accustomed to ruling under the banner of God, this was an intolerable reversal. And then there was the deeper wound, the question of identity, of whose story was allowed to stand at the center of salvation history. The Black Biblical Israelites, for centuries treated as a marginal note in the narrative, were here not merely acknowledged but enthroned at the heart of divine purpose. The prayer did not speak of them as latecomers to the covenant or as distant recipients of second-hand grace. It placed them at the origin and in the unbroken continuity of God's unfolding work. It testified that God had walked beside them through every exile, from the heat-shimmering banks of the Nile to the shadowed streets of Babylon, across the salt-foamed seas to the strange and often hostile continents where their descendants would be scattered. The prayer remembered them in the language of intimacy, not conquest. It affirmed that their story was a golden thread in the tapestry of creation, one that no empire's scissors had the right to cut. To acknowledge this was to confess that the biblical narrative, as commonly told, had been narrowed, whitewashed, and pruned of its wild branches in favor of a singular imperial image. It was to admit that the living witness of these people had been systematically muted, their voices pressed into the margins so that the center might be painted in the image of empire. In unveiling this prayer, Leo was not simply revealing a text, he was tearing away the veil from a centuries-long suppression of truth. He was declaring that the kingdom of God was larger, wilder, and far less containable than the kingdoms of men could bear to imagine. And that, above all, was what made these 20 lines so dangerous. Not their beauty, not their antiquity, but their refusal to be chained. Their unrelenting power to set fire to every altar erected in service to power rather than to love. Pope Leo XIV, then, warns, once you hear this prayer, your faith will never be the same. When at last Pope Leo XIV chose to speak the prayer aloud, he did not ascend the resplendent heights of the Sistine Chapel, nor did he frame it with choirs and ceremony. Instead, he stepped into a small courtyard shrouded in the solemn intimacy of torchlight, where the night air seemed to lean in upon itself, and a humble circle of believers from many nations gathered as though drawn by some ancient gravitational pull. Flame shadows swayed upon faces of every hue, upon garments stitched in patterns from distant homelands, upon eyes that carried both skepticism and longing. When he began, his voice did not shout, but unfurled each phrase, translated into a dozen tongues, rolled like slow thunder across an open plain, and then, in the next breath, descended to whisper like rain upon thirsty ground. Witnesses would later speak of an almost physical change in the atmosphere, as if the molecules themselves had thickened and the space between earth and heaven had been drawn into a single trembling thread. Some wept without knowing why, as though grief and joy had met at a secret crossroads within them. Others stood motionless, their bodies rigid under the weight of something too vast to comprehend. And when the final word fell into silence, that silence was not empty, it was dense, full, alive. Yet Leo made no claim of wonders in the worldly sense. He offered no promise that the sick would rise from their beds, nor that the palaces of tyrants would crumble in an instant. What he offered instead was the unsettling certainty that the one who spoke this prayer would not leave it unchanged. He warned them that these words, once truly uttered, would ignite in the soul a sense of divine nearness, so fierce, so intimate, that forgetting it would be impossible. After you speak these words, he told them, his gaze sweeping across the circle, you will find the image of God staring back at you in every stranger's face. You will no longer be able to bow before the idols of nation, of race, of wealth, without feeling the wound of betrayal burning in your own heart. It was a simple truth, but it was dangerous, for faith that refuses to bow to injustice cannot be bent into the service of empire. Such a faith becomes wild, ungovernable, steadfast in mercy, yet fierce against oppression. No empire can survive it, for it will not kill at their command, nor anoint their greed with holy oil. And this was why the prayer had been hunted across centuries, why those who carried it had been driven into exile, their names unrecorded, yet their absence palpable in the gaps of history. Why priests of old had feared the sound of it upon the lips of the people, knowing that once spoken, it would loosen every chain and set fire to every false altar. In the weeks that followed its revelation, the church became a landscape of whispers. Some, their hearts set aflame, called Leo a prophet. Others, their voices sharpened by fear, branded him a heretic. Theologians spilled their ink in frantic debates over its authenticity, parsing each stroke of the ancient letters as if truth itself could be contained within the precision of a script. Politicians whose crowns glittered alike under steeples and in Senate halls calculated the cost of aligning with or against it, weighing how much of the prayer's wildfire they might contain without burning themselves. Yet beyond the palaces and pulpits, in places untouched by the councils of power, the prayer began its quiet migration. In cramped apartments and village huts, in refugee tents and prison cells, small gatherings formed. They spoke it in the mother tongues of their ancestors and in the adopted languages of their exile, feeling in its cadence the same unquenchable fire that had once carried the Israelites through deserts and waters, through the 1,000 nights of waiting for dawn. Pope Leo XIV would not live to see its full journey. His own life was brief after the unveiling. Some whispered that the sheer weight of the truth he bore crushed his body. Others, with darker suspicion, believed that unseen hands hurried him into the grave before he could unearth more than one scroll. But whatever befell the man, the words he freed would not return to their chains. They were copied by trembling hands on scraps of paper, committed to memory like contraband treasure, sewn into the linings of clothing, smuggled across borders in whispered syllables. In kitchens and courtyards, around fire pits, and in the hidden corners of cathedrals, the name of God was spoken as though he were seated at the table, as though his breath still warmed the bread and his hands still poured the wine. The story of Pope Leo XIV's revelation remains contested, debated in seminaries, dismissed in some quarters as legend, venerated in others as the last great act of papal courage. Yet the message has slipped the grasp of debate. Whether the scroll is deemed authentic or apocryphal, the truth in its marrow rings with a clarity no authority can unhear. God is not the property of any empire, and the soul's cry for justice will outlive every throne. And perhaps Leo might have said, had he lived longer, that is the miracle we most forget to name, that in a world quick to bury its prophets, the words of liberation still find the cracks in the soil, still rise like shoots from hidden roots, still bloom in the very places where power thought the ground forever barren.